Ted Williams called him a potential 400 hitter. Orlando Cepeda called him the best born hitter he'd ever seen. He was the active leader in batting average for a large portion of his career. He also lied about his age, feuded with star players, punched a fan in the minors, got fined for insulting an umpire, got suspended for shoving an umpire, and burned bridges with every team he ever played for. He was a diva, a head case, a generational talent, and one of the most misunderstood players of his era. His name is Rico Carty, and he may be the greatest forgotten baseball star of the past 50 years. Rico was born to a family of 16 kids in San Pedro de Macorís in the Dominican Republic ruled by the tyrannical dictator Rafael Trujillo. His mother was a midwife, and his father worked in sugar mills owned by a U.S. corporation. He grew up in poverty playing baseball in the streets using balls made from socks. Rico's left leg was longer than his right, and once he was able to afford them, he bought a pair of special orthopedic shoes. He was a broad-shouldered, muscle-bound teenager, 6'4" tall with a booming voice, and an amateur boxer with a career record of 17-0. But in his 18th fight, Rico got nauseous after taking a punch and vomited all over the ring. The fight was called, Rico's undefeated streak was over, and he was so embarrassed he switched from boxing to baseball. Kids in the Dominican at this time were playing baseball from the time they could walk, as dictator Trujillo was a diehard baseball fan. He does get some of the credit for this generation of Latin American baby boomers who came trampling across the fallen color barriers. Teams opened up their scouting to the Caribbean, an untapped source of talent. Like the spies of the ancient Israelites, U.S. scouts came back with news that there were giants in the land. Juan Marichal, the Alou family, and other Dominican prospects were showcased at the annual Pan American Games. Rico Carty played in the 1959 games and was impressive enough to sign contracts with no less than 12 major league teams, 4 Dominican teams, and other clubs elsewhere in Latin America. The St. Louis Cardinals sent him a contract with the value left blank, expecting him to write in a salary of his choice. Eventually, the major league teams got together and realized that over half of them had just signed the same prospect, but they figured it out, and the Braves wound up with Rico. It's unclear what Rico is expecting by doing this. Maybe he's confused, or the contracts were in English, or maybe he was just so cocky that he thought he could get away with it somehow. I mean, the guy was a hot dog, not only talking in the third person, but calling himself the big boy. According to Joe Posnanski's Substack, everyone in baseball either called him the big boy or the big man, including Bill James, who profiled Rico in his Baseball Abstract. Quote, "The big boy was a friendly, manipulative, emotional Dominican who wore cowboy hats and cowboy boots and smoked big cigars, sort of half Texan and half Dominican," unquote. And yes, that's big, spelled B-E-E-G, because sports writers in the early 60s quoted people phonetically, Mark Twain style. And if you're an adaptable type like Rico, you make lemonade from these lemons. The media called Rico Carty the big boy, so Rico called Rico Carty the big boy. It's fitting. His given name sounds like a musician, so his nickname does likewise. I mean, if you told me a month ago that the 2 surviving members of Migos were called Rico Carty and Big Boy, I wouldn't have believed you, but my mom probably would. Anyway, in 1963, he was a top catching prospect for the Braves, but they already had a young star at catcher, Joe Torre, so Rico moved to left field because his bat was too good to keep out of the lineup. He had 2 calling cards as a hitter. First, he hit to dead center, splitting the infielders, a skill he attributed to playing in a narrow street as a kid in San Pedro. And second, his knack for hitting with 2 strikes. Quote, "The best 2-strike pitch to Rico Carty is a pickoff throw to first," as Hall of Fame pitcher Jim Catt once said. Rico's approach was to take the first pitch no matter what and let the pitcher show their hand. "After I got that strike," he said, "now I'm a hitter. I'll give them that strike and I'll go from there on." While doing so, he stood motionless in the batter's box, staring at the pitcher. He took no practice swings before stepping to the plate and was known to quote-unquote scream at pitchers who threw breaking balls. It didn't take long for him to gain a reputation as an intimidator and, a weirdo. I mean, his superstition was floating candles in the bathtub and toilet before every game. He played with his wallet in his uniform pants because he distrusted banks and other people. And at least the tail end of his career, his walk-up song was this dopey xylophone music.
Going last night.
That's right. The big boy wasn't supposed to play. And, he came in and pinch hit and got that home run. Put him right back in the ball game.
The big boy in 1964 was Rookie of the Year runner-up to Dick Allen, and his .330 batting average was runner-up to Roberto Clemente. Writing in 2000, Bill James called Rico's 1964 season the best by a rookie left fielder since World War II. He was an instant hit, immensely popular with Braves fans and the Dominican community. San Pedro today is called the baseball capital of the world, but they didn't have a real major league star until now, and the Dominican more broadly didn't have one until Felipe Alou a couple years earlier, now a teammate of the big boy. Coincidentally, the next superstar to come from San Pedro will be the guy most similar to Rico, the great 80s slugger Pedro Guerrero. And like Guerrero, Rico didn't really have a position. He was a slow former catcher who took bizarre paths to track and fly balls. Former teammate Clete Boyer said, quote, "If I were the manager, I'd put Felipe Alou on left center, Hank Aaron in right center, and Carty in the right field bullpen where he can chase foul balls," end quote. So next season, the Braves tried teaching him first base, and he hurt his back, losing half the season to injury and never playing more than a week at a time. A healthy 1966 followed, and finishing third in the NL in hitting confirmed his status as a rising star. But then things got complicated. In 1967, he collided with second baseman Ron Hunt while stealing a base and separated his shoulder. He then got apparently hurt in a car crash, which I wish I could find more info about, but he played through both of these injuries and other nagging issues like a cough he developed down the stretch. His stats declined, and he developed a reputation as a bit of a hypochondriac. But all that was overshadowed by what happened the night of June 19th, 1967, in a plane above the Arizona desert. There are multiple accounts of how it started. Henry Aaron says Rico was gossiping about him in Spanish. Others say Aaron and Clete Boyer accused Rico of being lazy. Either way, Rico and Aaron got talking. Rico got heated, called him a black bastard, a black SOB, and worse things which I won't repeat. Aaron shot back, quote, "You're not exactly pink yourself," and Rico threw a punch. The two got in such a brawl that, according to the Arkansas Democrat-Gazette, quote, "The pilot had to take measures to stabilize the plane after the turbulence in the aft," end quote. A stray punch from Aaron dented the luggage compartment above Rico's head, and it took 4 players, including Bob Euchre and a team secretary, to pull them apart. The two were roommates previously, and while the more quiet and straight-laced Aaron had always found the mercurial big boy a bit obnoxious, he wanted to be a mentor and sort of older brother figure. But this was the end of cordial relations between the two. The Braves assigned them new roommates, and at several points going forward, the Braves' 2 biggest bats were not on speaking terms. Personally, having read Henry Aaron's autobiography as a kid, this story was the only thing I knew about Rico Carty. But 1968 followed 1967. The Braves reported to spring training, and Rico being Rico, one day he decided to fake sick. He was taken to the team doctors, and to his surprise, they found tuberculosis. And they sent him home. And the disease got worse. Spring training ended. The regular season began, and Rico was still bedridden and getting worse by the day. He checked into the southeastern Florida tubercular sanitarium with an indefinite time schedule. 1 month, 2 months, 3 months, 4 months in the hospital, 5 months in the hospital. He not only missed the entire season, he spent almost all of it away from his home. These were dark days for a man accustomed to making his living outside, a gregarious extrovert, born to cater to fawning crowds. Now his career was in jeopardy, and some observers remarked that he was lucky to be alive. When the big man returned in 1969, he was understandably a fan favorite, a feel-good story. Still recovering from tuberculosis, still not 100%, going on 3 years of battling this confounding illness, which he realized in hindsight was already creeping up on him in 1967 with that nagging cough. Somehow, against all probability, Rico Carty batted .342, .401, .549, better than he ever had before. The doctors who treated him at that Florida sanitarium mentioned Rico to patients for years to come as an exemplar of successful recovery. Atlanta Stadium christened the left field stands Carty's Corner, where an appreciative big boy often lingered 2 to 3 hours after games, chatting with fans and signing autographs. But his injury bug returned with him, and he claimed that in 1969 he suffered a separated shoulder on 7 separate occasions. I've read 5 and 3 shoulder separations in other sources, so it appears he changed the story sometimes. However many, it limited him to 104 games, and it was hard to be too optimistic about a guy with this kind of injury history, even coming off a 164 OPS+. A regression to the mean was expected. In 1970, Rico Carty was hands down the best player on the Braves and one of the premier players in all of baseball. Only a dozen players since 1950 have hit for a higher average in a season, comprising 17 seasons. At the dawn of the 70s, a time when batting average was king, Rico was the active leader, second only to Clemente from 1960 to 1970, a bona fide superstar with a real shot at Cooperstown. Atlanteans polled on their favorite athlete in any sport voted 60% for the big boy at a time when the Braves prominently featured 4 Hall of Famers. They made him the first write-in All-Star in baseball history after he was left off the ballot at the start of 1970. The consensus back then was this guy was a folk hero, a heartwarming story, but not a serious MVP candidate or anything like that. And yet here he was, batting .420 in June. According to Rico, he wasn't an all-star until 1970 because the managers wouldn't allow it. You see, the all-stars before 1970 were chosen by other players and managers, not by fans, and Rico knew he was polarizing. Fans got Dr. Jekyll, the opposing players and the umpires he confronted got Mr. Hyde. Perfect example, on August 19, 1970, Rico got into a fist fight with teammate Ron Reed before the game. Some bats were missing from Reed's locker, and he was furious to learn Rico had given them away as souvenirs to some kids in the stands. This is a guy who gave so many fly balls to fans throughout the course of the season instead of giving them back to the umpires that he was fined an average of $5,000 per year by the commissioner. And even in a career year, Rico made time to feud with Henry Aaron. In past years, Aaron hit third and Rico hit cleanup, but now he had a new best friend, future Hall of Famer Orlando Cepeda, and Rico insisted on batting fifth to protect Cepeda rather than Aaron. Cepeda had a resurgent season in 1970 and created the big boy in part for helping him out, but everyone knew it was a little absurd for the Braves' best hitter to insist on hitting fifth, going as far as to write his name on the 5 spot on his manager's blank lineup cards. Squabbles aside, this was a dream season, due to health as much as production. Between Rico's last healthy season in 1970, you can fit Jimi Hendrix's entire career. But in December, playing in the Dominican Winter League, he ran back to chase a fly ball and collided with Matty Lou, breaking his leg in 3 places and tearing every ligament in it. Team doctor Harry Rogers called it, quote, as bad a knee injury as an athlete can have. I find this quote especially revealing. Why always you, his wife asked him, arriving at the hospital as she was used to doing by now. I guess it's just my destiny, replied Rico. He was expected to return by late summer, and the Braves handed out these pins on August 5th, 1971 to the first 15,000 fans in attendance. And whether or not you believe in jinxes, Rico developed a blood clot in his leg and missed this game and the entire season, the second in 4 years as doctors dealt with the complications. In the meantime, his restaurant, Rico Carty Open Pit Barbecue, burned down. Quote, I'm a human being and things are going to happen to me, he said, referring to the injury. Could have happened to me on the street. That fall, with his bum leg still in a cast, Rico got in a fight with a trio of men who called him the N-word on a street in Atlanta. They turned out to be off-duty cops. One had a billy club and hit Rico in the face with it multiple times, giving him 2 black eyes, permanent eye damage, massive bruises, and a gash in one of his fingers. Rico's 19-year-old brother-in-law tried coming to his defense and was pistol-whipped. Some accounts say they then pulled out their badges and arrested him. The undercover cops were taken to court, where they lied, changed their stories, and were eventually fired from the police force and reproached by the mayor.
They said to allow 8 of you to be handcuffed?
For me? No, he took it off his own self.
What about,
He took it off his own self. After I told him I was Rico, and he realized that I was Rico, I was down on the ground, and all 3 of them was hitting me. So when they hit me about the 5th time, I said, I'm Rico, I'm Rico. So these one decided to say, he ain't no damn Rico. And then this cop that was hitting me, that slapjack in my face, said, who the hell cares who he is?
The beating of Rico Carty garnered major headlines, another bloody thread in the sprawling tapestry of the civil rights movement, and his fame allowed a rare opportunity for justice and even catharsis in an all-too-common case of police brutality. But Rico slipped into depression nonetheless. Of course, he dealt with racism before. Anyone familiar with this era can speak of the abuse Henry Aaron received from a certain segment of baseball fans. But there was a complexity here. Rico was proud of his Dominican heritage, and part of that pride for him was not wanting to be mistaken for an African American. There's an anecdote of him telling off an owner of a segregated Cuban restaurant in Florida in the 60s for treating him like a quote-unquote American Negro. He grew up in a society stratified among class status lines where, in his account, the color of one's skin had minimal bearing on how people perceived them. And now had to navigate a society so race-obsessed that he switched his nickname from the Big Boy to the Big Man because his black teammates didn't like seeing him called Boy. With the story of his beating disappearing from the news cycle, Rico was hurt, and the Lord only knows the extent of the healing he would need to come back in '72. Plenty of baseball stars have missed a season due to injury, but has anyone of his caliber missed 2 non-consecutive full seasons in their prime? Unless you count World War II, I can't find anyone who has. Moise Alou missed 2 non-consecutive full seasons, but the first one he was still a prospect. Hank Greenberg came close, and so did Chris Carpenter and Kerry Wood, but neither of them missed 2 full seasons truly like Rico did. He gets quoted around this time saying, "I'd rather be lucky than good," or "It's better to be lucky than good," or "They say you have to be good to be lucky, but I think you have to be lucky to be good." This man who responded so stoically to losing 2 prime seasons and large parts of other years to injury, this is the guy who is dismissed as a diva? Here's the dramatic irony of Rico Carty. "Oh, he's a whiner," they say. "It's always something with that guy. Missed another game, huh? What, he break a fingernail? Ha ha ha." And yet, it's a documented fact that he injured his eye being beaten by cops, that he lost over a year to tuberculosis, lost another to a broken leg, had one leg longer than the other and wore special shoes to correct it. For all we know, he had brain injuries from boxing. And just to compound the irony, according to Bill James's Baseball Encyclopedia, quote, "His parents had wanted him to become a doctor, but he fainted at the sight of blood," unquote. What more can a guy do than come back and try to keep smiling? At what point do we say that his reputation was more a media stereotype than a reality? Rico is still just 31. He was the active leader in batting average, and he had a career stat line of 322, 389, 507, an OPS plus of 146. Just for comparison, Paul Goldschmidt, probably the best pure hitter in the National League right now, a guy who's never had a down season, has a career OPS plus of 145. If Carty never played another game after 1970, he would still today be the greatest left fielder in Braves franchise history, measured in wins above replacement. But to quote Joe Posnanski, he seemed drained by it all. Carty couldn't run, he couldn't field, he couldn't throw, he had tuberculosis, he had waged wars with people throughout baseball. It was over. And while his career wasn't quite over, his tenure with the Braves was almost up. He had a down season, clashed with Hank Aaron and new manager Eddie Matthews, and was traded to the Rangers in 1972 for this guy. Matthews didn't like Rico, and Rico didn't like Matthews, prompting him to successfully sue the Braves for $20,000 they never got around to paying him in his lost 1971 season. The Rangers manager, Whitey Herzog, didn't like him either. He called him a Boy Scout and said he's seen better knees on a camel. Rico at this stage was insanely slow. His scouting report on baseballegg.com gives him a 20 speed tool, not MLB caliber. The site gave a 40 to Yadi Molina. But even with the down year, in his first 10 years in the majors, all with the Braves, he was 9th in OPS, on a list crawling with Hall of Famers. His batting average is still tops among Braves since their move to Atlanta. But 1973 started bad and got worse. He broke his jaw in Winter League after a hit by pitch, but that was par for the course. Rico's real complaint was the new DH position. Even before the injuries, the big man was a converted catcher who never really got comfortable anywhere on the field, but at this stage his defensive skills were, quote, "amusing at best," in the words of Sports Illustrated, which is why, to quote Jock Harris from OutfieldFlyRule.com, he was seen as the poster boy for the position and was traded to the AL in hopes that he would take advantage of it. He didn't want to, end quote. Rico insisted on playing the field, playing 53 games in left and 31 games at DH for the Rangers. He slumped at the plate, blaming this on the DH and the frigid Dallas weather, making his toes numb. And in the inaugural year of the DH, the Rangers had the worst ones in baseball. They released Rico mid-season after he broke his foot. He signed with the Cubs, batted .214 with no power, blamed his slump on Ron Santo, the face of the franchise, who he called a selfish player, and he was run out of Chicago after 22 games. His next stop was Oakland, where he had 10 plate appearances and 7 games for them in the regular season, was ineligible for postseason play as a late pickup, and didn't get to celebrate the first World Series his team had ever won. Rico claimed the A's never even gave him a ring. He demanded a trade to an NL team, calling the AL a weak league with weak pitching despite his struggles there, but there were no takers. The A's released him outright, bringing his worst season to a close. He signed with the Mexican League's Cafeteros de Cordoba in 1974, trying to play his way back into the majors, and in over 500 plate appearances, he hit like what he was, a major league talent stuck in a minor league limbo. Finally, on August 17, 1974, Cleveland signed him as a right-handed DH to spell Oscar Gamble. It was a shot in the dark by a bad team with a bad offense, and Rico conceded he'd rather DH in the majors than play left field in Veracruz. In 33 games, he batted well enough to earn him the DH job next year, with Gamble moving to left field, because as we all know, the Cleveland outfield is the correct place for baseball players named Oscar. Rico hit .363, .396, .451, a great small sample size. And in 1975, over a full season of play, he hit even better. He was the 11th best hitter in baseball with over 400 plate appearances. He was the best hitter over the age of 33 on a new team playing a position he disliked as a contact hitter with permanent eye damage, one leg longer than the other, and the knees of a 50-year-old. Rico missed 2 full seasons in his prime with health issues, and now he could say he came back from both of them. He is the best player ever to accomplish this, I'm fully convinced. And it isn't just this hitting that returned, it's his real passion in life, which is pissing off baseball legends. In 1977, Cleveland baseball writers named Rico the Indians' Man of the Year, and he used his acceptance speech to insult manager Frank Robinson, who was seated in the front row. When Robinson was fired a couple months later, some of the press blamed Carty, which is where that "kiss him on the boo-boo" quote comes from. Robinson, in case you don't know, was an Inner Circle Hall of Fame player and the first black manager in the majors, and Carty won a self-described Cold War against him, which wouldn't be possible if he didn't rake. Rico hit almost as well in 4 years with Cleveland as he did with Atlanta, and amazingly, he had a better OPS plus with Cleveland in his first 6 years in the majors with the Braves, the 6 years before he missed 68 with tuberculosis. He was baseball's best designated hitter in 75, second best in 76, and best again in 78 when he set the record for home runs by a DH with 31. He was the best primary DH of the 70s and 80s who played at least 1,000 games, all of that coming after his nightmare 1971 and his falling out with the Braves. He was and still is the oldest player to hit his 200th career home run less than a month before his 40th birthday in 1979. Only 14 players in Major League Baseball history played more and hit better past the age of 35 than Rico Carty, a guy who spent most of the year in which he turned 35 playing semi-pro ball in Mexico, written off by the baseball gatekeepers as a banged-up clown with worse knees than a camel.
Maybe some people forget that Rico led the National League in hitting back in 1960 or 70, I should say, with Atlanta. That at 366 has a 305 lifetime average.
Maybe we can get a look at where Trammell and Whitaker are playing this fella, too. Maybe we get a shot of it in a moment. They're so far in the outfield, they're going to have to throw a one-hopper to first base.
They look like short fielders there. Softball. But again, they can get away with it. They got good arms, and they know that Carty cannot run. He's had a series of knee operations and leg operations throughout his career. He is up there simply for the stick and the power.
But this clown got the last laugh. Before the 1979 season, he managed to sign a 5-year guaranteed deal with the Blue Jays with an infamous 32-page contract mocked by the press as a lifetime deal. The joke being he'd die in his early 40s. A developing team coming off a 102-loss season signed a 39-year-old injury-prone designated hitter to a 5-year guaranteed deal, and as people were realizing, that age was an estimate. Rico was briefly a Blue Jay before. They took him in the 1977 expansion draft only to trade him back to Cleveland 1 month later for John Lowenstein, who himself was traded back to Cleveland, all within one offseason. The Jays fan base turned on Rico once some of the contract's provisions were leaked, like a private limo and a king-sized bed everywhere he stayed on the road, and his pervasive minor injuries got increasingly bizarre. He once claimed he was slumping because his hand was swollen after he poked it with a toothpick. He was injured again in spring training 1980 and released, leaving the final 4 years of his contract on the books. Rico left us with the most turbulent career arc I know, outside of maybe Jeff Heath, whose seasons looked to be literally randomized, when he retired at age 40 as the best reluctant designated hitter in baseball, the best Braves left fielder in history, the all-time home run leader of the Dominican Winter League, and a trailblazing hero in the Dominican Republic, where he holds an honorary general's rank and still appears in Spanish-language media from time to time, and especially in San Pedro de Macorís, where he works at the Carty Foundation, which provides food, medicine, and clothing for poor people in the city he grew up in and came back home to. He started playing baseball closer in time to the invention of the movie projector, the license plate, and Pepsi than to the current day. But Rico Carty still walks this earth at the age of 83.